very good afternoon to everyone from the Center for Behavioral and Implementation Science Interventions, also known as BISI, at the NUS Yong Lin School of Medicine. I'm Eugene, a Senior Research Fellow at BISI, and I have the pleasure of being your moderator for the 15th episode of our BISI webinar series on rethinking behavior change. To truly achieve meaningful real-world change, we need to rethink how behavior change is approached. Today, we'll explore behavioral pluralism, the integration of diverse theories and methods to design more effective and context-sensitive interventions. We're very glad to have with us two distinguished experts in this field who are also from BISI. First, we have Professor Ivo Vlaev. Professor Ivo received his PhD in experimental psychology from the University of Oxford and has held positions at UCL, Imperial College, and Warwick Business School. He is also a co-author of the influential Mindspace report for the UK Cabinet Office, which helped establish the first behavioural insights team in government. We're also delighted to have Prof. Giuseppe Alessandro Veltri. Prof. Giuseppe holds a Master of Science and PhD from the London School of Economics and has previously worked with the École Normale Supérieure in Paris and the European Commission's Joint Research Centre. His work sits at the intersection of behavioral and computational social science, focusing on innovative methods to better understand and influence human behavior in complex systems. Without further ado, let us begin with Ivo first, followed by Giuseppe, and Q&A from the audience. Prof. Ivo, you can now take the virtual floor.
Thank you, Eugene. That was quite an introduction. I feel like I should retire now before I ruin the legend you just built. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. Wonderful to see so many names appearing. It's the kind of digital version of people filling into the room, just with less coffee. So we're here to talk about behavioral change, a topic that sounds simple until you try to get your colleagues, your patients, or let's be honest, yourself to actually do it. We've all seen what happens when we rely on classical information campaign approach. It's like throwing facts at people and hoping one fact sticks somewhere between the TikTok and lunch plans, which would be all fine if our old bad habits only affect our step counts and our snack choices, but they don't. Beneath that everyday struggle lies something far more consequential. Behavior shapes nearly every major challenge we face in our society. Human behavior greatly affects our health, our wealth, our environment. For example, many of the biggest policy challenges in health we are facing now, smoking, obesity, healthcare-associated infections, are related to the choices people make, to smoke, to drink, to eat poorly, not to exercise, some to take drugs, and so on. There are significant financial and societal costs to unhealthy behaviors. So today we're going pluralistic. Think of it as the buffet version of behavioral science. Why limit yourself to just one theory when you can have a little cognitive science, a dash of behavioral economics, a spoonful of social psychology, and maybe a sprinkle of implementation science on top? Our goal is simple today, to explore how this richer, more mechanistic way of thinking can help us design interventions that actually work in the messy, unpredictable world, real world, where people don't read the instructions and rarely act like the models we are in our theories. So please grab your mental plate, help yourself with some pluralism, and by the end of this hour, I promise you, you'll see why behavioral change isn't about choosing the right theory. It's about combining them intelligently for real-world impact. So let's dive into behavioral change. Now, before we got too excited about frameworks and pluralism, let's ground ourselves in something deceptively simple. What actually counts as a behavioral change intervention? In short, it's any deliberate activity that gets people to do something differently from how they normally behave. Simple, right? Until you realize this could mean almost anything, from quitting smoking to recycling to getting your colleagues to finally fill out that ethics form, always late, like me. You can change what people do, how often they do it, how long they do it for, what they do, when they do it. In other words, behavioral change is a bit like parenting, but with slightly more PowerPoints, like today. So whether you're trying to get people to walk more, to eat less, or just show up on time in the office, what we're really doing is designing structured ways to tilt behavior away from the default and towards something better, hopefully something better. The behavioral change revolution started in 2008. when Taylor and Sunstein published the book Nudge, a book that spread through governments and boardrooms faster than behavioral contagion. So nudge is grounded in the idea of automatic processes. People don't make decisions by carefully weighing the pros and the cons. They rely on shortcuts, context, and tiny cues that quietly shape what they do. Numerous heuristics and cognitive biases, a bit of jargon, shape our actions far away from conscious deliberation, and much more powerfully than conscious deliberation ever does. And that's precisely why, by triggering those biases in the right way, we can also nudge people in the right direction towards healthier, safer, and more sustainable choices. So the book took the world by storm, or as they might prefer to say by choice architecture, which is defined pretty precisely. The idea was deceptively simple. Small, low-cost tweaks in how choices are presented can steer people towards better decisions without taking away their freedom to choose. And that simplicity is genius. Suddenly, policymakers, CEOs, and even prime ministers and presidents were talking about nudging, not lecturing, not regulating, but designing environments that make the right thing the easy thing, from automatic pension enrollments to organ donation defaults and healthier food placements in cafeterias. Nudge created a global movement. It reframed how we think about human behavior, not as irrational chaos to be controlled, make people more rational, always deliberating every choice, but as something that can be shaped gently and intelligently through design. It was the spark that lit the nudge revolution, and in many ways, the birth of behavioral public policy as we know it nowadays. But of course, every revolution matures, and eventually we realized nudging alone is not always enough. That's where the next chapter begins. So, all right, let's hop in our behavioral time machine and head back to 2011, when nudge was the new celebrity of public policy. Everyone wanted a piece of it. Politicians, civil servants, even economists pretending they've always been interested in human psychology. But then came the House of Lords report in the UK, which basically said, nice idea, but where is the evidence? So they found, and I quote here, precious little proof that nudging really changed behavior at scale. Translation, for the audience, the hype was ahead of the data. The conclusion was refreshingly pragmatic. Nudges work best when they're part of a package. In other words, you can't just redesign the cafeteria and expect obesity to vanish. Sometimes you also need restrictions like smoke-free zones, coercion, price increases on alcohol, individual support like stop smoking services. So by 2011, the message was clear. Nudges are the spice, but not the main dish. You still need a full policy meal, regulation, pricing, and proper support. You actually want to change behavior in the real world, you need all these tools of government. So where do we go after the nudge era? The global boom in behavioral units. So fast forward more than a decade and look at this map from OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's an intergovernmental organization of 38 member states that works to build better policies for better lives and promoting prosperity and so on. So there are more than 400 behavioral units around the world, governmental, non-governmental, academic, popping up faster than mushrooms after a warm rain, like here in Singapore. And as any behavioral scientist might tell you, it's a lot of mushrooms. So everyone wanted their own nudge unit, their own lab, their own dashboard of insights, and that's fantastic. Somewhere between 2011 and today, that precious little evidence grew up and became gloriously rich proof that nudging doesn't just complement interventions, it can sometimes be the main dish. And that was the birth of my career, translation of evidence into the real world. I descended from a blue sky scientist, experimental psychology, scanning brain for a living, down into the real messy world of policymaking and applied research. But after this initial excitement, the big question became, why do some of these teams thrive while others quietly fade away like an unclicked online consent form, for example? So my colleagues and I decided to find out. We studied how these units actually work in the real world and what separates the successful one from the rest. And here's what we found out after a bit of research. Just one simple, powerful principle: multidisciplinarity. multidisciplinarity. So the best teams weren't the ones that stuck to a single theory or method. They were the ones who mix economists with psychologists, designers with implementers, data nerds with policy people. That's the real superpower. Not just nudging, but bringing the right mix of minds to design smarter, context-sensitive interventions. So let's see, what does this mean in practice? It means that, well, we need to seek to understand the whys and the hows of human behavior at different levels of analysis, but bringing together insights from several disciplines, utilizing different methodologies. I'm reading it out on the slide. Well, different levels of analysis, biological level, individual level, human beings, what drives their behavior, their ethnicity, gender, genetics, personhood, individual psychological level, individual thoughts and feelings, family and friends, relationship and social support matters as well. Community and neighborhoods, we need to understand the social capital and the community networks. Well, we need to understand the environmental and social systems, the broader picture, living and working conditions. We need to understand policy, socioeconomic, cultural, and environmental conditions. So these are determinants of behavior at different levels of analysis. And they come from different disciplines: psychology, sociology, anthropology, economics, political science, administration science, education, geography, biology, medicine, engineering. All that matters. We bring everybody to the table utilizing different methodologies, systematic reviews, interviews, observations, ethnographic work, surveys, experiments, and data science and AI in the end of the day. So everybody should make an impact in our understanding the whys and hows of human behavior, and what can we do to change this behavior once understanding the big why. So here's my mechanistic framework for behavioral change design, distilling from all these sciences, trying to give you a simple tool to go ahead and apply all this knowledge into understanding the why of human behavior and the how of human behavior, how to change it. So we always have a physical, social, or psychological outcome, a real physical outcome in the world that we want to improve, which is a result of human behavior, obviously action, and then this is a result of behavioral determinants. The first step is to identify these individual determinants, the mechanisms, and then we apply behavioral change techniques to influence these determinants. So we need to identify what techniques are going to affect each determinant, and then we need to identify the link between specific techniques, we call them nudges or some other term like behavioral change techniques, to understand how they influence each of these mechanisms, the barriers and facilitators to action. So all these mechanisms need to be diagnosed in the first step, using different theories and frameworks to understand what prevents people from doing what they're meant to be doing. So how do we go about selecting theory? Gosh, look at this. It's a dog's dinner. It's a spaghetti dish. It's a mess. There are too many behavioral models, theories, and frameworks to help us find these mechanisms. Sometimes they talk about the same mechanism using different language, about different mechanisms using the same words. It's a mess. And what can you do? If you're not a psychologist spending 4 years at university, you need help. And the help came, me and other colleagues included, to design these frameworks, simple frameworks that you can use to actually influence human behavior. The mind-space framework, the EAST framework, the behavioral change wheel framework, and others. They're condensing this knowledge into a checklist, into a taxonomy of mechanisms that you can cherry pick to understand, to diagnose the problem, why people are not doing what they're meant to be doing. And you don't need only a framework, and a causal step of analysis from mechanisms to behavior and then back to behavioral change techniques. You need an intervention development cycle, and this is the point here I'm trying to make. So you need solid model how to design intervention from the initial question down to the implementation and the testing. So how does that go? Very simply, first task is to understand the behavioral diagnosis of what are the barriers, what are the facilitators. You can use existing knowledge from research and practice reviews, whatever you can find, applying the framework to understand the barriers and facilitators, the mechanisms. That's the first step. We can find information from realities of people's lives using surveys, observations, focus groups, interviews, data science. Once you understand the barriers, facilitators, you design intervention based on these barriers, facilitators, as we shown you in the previous diagram, to attack each of these mechanisms and to produce change. We need to co-design with colleagues from stakeholders from different backgrounds, because everybody has a unique insight, not just the academics, but the practitioner as well. And then you specify a logic model. You pre-evaluate your intervention. You pre-evaluate your intervention. This is where we're missing a lot here in the usual design of interventions, the pre-evaluation stage, to model the possible effects, to see whether you can evaluate the outcomes from the intervention. We need to create a lab whether it's a virtual lab or real lab, or a way to actually test this logic model. And finally, the litmus test, using data science, you implement the intervention, see what the results are, and you analyze the process. What changed as a result of your intervention? Not just the outcome, not just the behavior, but what mechanism changed. And that's why you need process evaluation. And finally, well, you need to optimize your intervention. Identify the optimal combination of those and these components, improving the reach, the effectiveness, the adoption, the implementation, and the maintenance of the intervention. It's a full cycle. It's a recipe for success. Intervention development cycle needs to be followed with the tools at hand, which are the theories that we just showed to you. So let me illustrate this process with a case study, hand hygiene. I've done a lot of these hand hygiene interventions in the past. So we started with system mapping to understand the mechanisms why doctors and nurses are not washing their hands. We start from the first step, the understand stage. Well, we build a system map by trying to map the actors, the behaviors, and the influence on their behaviors. This is what system map is. We found that the nurses are washing hands with sanitizer, for example, when there is availability of sanitizer. But sometimes they're forgetting to wash. That's not just enough to understand why they're not washing their hands. Somebody has to clean the sanitizer dispenser, and that needs a cleaner. And then, well, the cleaner might not be available. What influences the behavior of the cleaner is the lack of time. And the lack of time is because there's no budget for agency staff, and multiple staff off sick during winter in the UK. But what we discovered was that forgetting was the main barrier to hand washing in this case. So let's go ahead and design an intervention. We design intervention using the MindSpace framework. MindSpace is a taxonomy of all the automatic effects on human behavior. All automatic effects on human behavior are classified and taxonomized in the MindSpace framework. There are more than 40 effects, as you can see here, the way that we perceive the incentives, the pros and cons of different actions, loss aversion, famous example of the way that we perceive the cost and benefits of actions. For example, the emotions, the memory, different mental faculties are classified according to the impact of different heuristics and biases. Emotions are affected by, for example, different types of mood congruence, hedonic adaptation. Memory is what we call priming in MindSpace. This is the accessibility of different information in your memory that may be important for your decisions. Attention, mental faculty. This is the saliency of the information in front of you. Different cognitive bias, such as confirmation bias, ambiguity effect, choice overload. Incentives, well, this affects the mental faculty of valuation. As I mentioned, loss aversion, decision-making processes, different mental faculty. This is the famous defaults. And then we have group perception, which we classified all the different types of perception of the norm in the society and how we can use this to manipulate behavior. We do what everybody else does, automatically, often subconsciously. And ego effect, this is the mental faculty of identity. Ego, we always strive to do what improves our self-image. And then we have executive function. This is the commitment devices that we can put in place, goal setting, planning, and so on. And then social cognition, the perception of who communicates the information, not what the information is about, whether we trust the messenger. All mental faculties are engaged with different heuristics and biases. So we classify the problem that we have at hand. Nurses and doctors forget. Okay, there must be a memory problem here. So let's use the priming techniques. Priming. Well, we design an intervention using priming in the lab to simulate intervention in the real world. What did we do? We found evidence that smell reminds people of hand hygiene, especially citrus smell, subconsciously. Even if you're not aware, the smell of lemons primes the memory of hand washing, because if you go to the bathroom, the hand washing liquid usually smells of lemons. So what if we release the smell of citrus fruit in a setting and test the intervention effectiveness on hand hygiene? Are doctors and nurses more likely to wash their hands if you release the citrus smell and subconsciously prime the memory of hand washing, which is exactly what we did during the pre-evaluation stage of this intervention. This is a simulation lab where doctors are working on a fake patient, trying to take a diagnosis, but we observe, are they washing their hands before touching the patient, after touching the patient, when we release the smell of lemons? Yes, they are. Significantly more doctors are hitting the dispenser and washing their hands. So it worked. Pre-evaluation showed promise. But the litmus test, the real test on human behavior in a real setting, in a hospital setting, well, in Miami University hospitals, despite traditional communication and motivation of the benefits of hand hygiene and the importance of reducing hospital-acquired infections, clinicians are not washing their hands. They only need to do is hit the dispenser before they enter the intensive care unit. They're not doing it. What can we do here? Well, we know that we need to remind them subconsciously, let's test what worked in the simulated environment in the real environment. And we did a trial, testing the effectiveness of priming, subconscious priming. We had a control condition, nothing, they entered the intensive care unit, and we had a priming condition, we released the smell of lemons. And we had two control conditions, intuitive interventions, not based on the framework, not based on the behavioral diagnosis, understanding as we go to the first stage, but intuitive. Let's try putting the human eyes above the dispenser, reminding people that somebody is watching them. There is evidence that artificial eyes or a picture of human eyes tends to induce compliance. So we had two intuitive interventions, male eyes and female eyes. So which one do you think worked best? Well, there's no time to guess, so let me try. It turns out the smell tripled the rate of hand hygiene. From 15% has to be 100% people dying to 47%. And the eyes, the male eyes worked a bit, they doubled the rate, and the female eyes, well, they didn't work. So we learned a very important lesson. So we go to the next stage, optimization, multifactorial, multi-context trial to optimize the intervention. We did it in Birmingham, not in the US, another part of the world, and we tested several interventions at once, actually two to be precise, with my colleagues in Birmingham, at different parts of the hospital, different contexts, different populations, different patients, the renal, the upper gastrointestinal, hematology, oncology, and admissions. And we test factorial design, smell, no smell, and eyes, and no eyes, because we found there is some bit of evidence that eyes might be working also. So there was a control condition, unique condition for smell, unique condition for eyes, and combination of the two. Let's try optimize, see if it works in different contexts. Well, we controlled, we measured, and the result was no effect. Flat lines. The primes did not increase the percentage of people who used gel or soap dispensers. What the hell is going on here? We're bewildered, stunned. We were hoping for success. The Lancet article was behind the corner. Of course, we had the methodology, very robust. When we go back to the understanding stage, we use different framework, the behavioral change wheel. The behavioral change wheel is another framework that condenses all the insights into three foundational pillars that influence behavior: capability, motivation, and opportunity. You need to be able to do it, you need to have the motivation to do it, and you have the opportunity to do it, which breaks down into several very specific mechanisms, such as knowledge, intention, behavior regulation, goals, beliefs about the consequences, beliefs about capabilities, social influence, and so on. And each of these mechanisms is connected to specific techniques that are proven to influence this mechanism. So goals and planning technique influence goals and intentions. Prompts and cues influence memory. So let's try to build a questionnaire based on these mechanisms, a ready designed questionnaire to understand why doctors are not washing hands in Birmingham when exposed to the smell or otherwise. And every mechanism, knowledge, professional role, identity, beliefs about capabilities, beliefs about consequences, motivation, goals, social influence, emotion, they're all broken down into validated questionnaire, a survey that you need to change only one word, the behavior, and throw it at people and ask them to answer to what extent these changes influence your behavior, and they to answer. And we discovered, using this new mechanistic approach from different framework, that the big reason in Birmingham is not forgetting, it was about social influence. It's hand hygiene is not encouraged by others. The senior staff does not really do the hand washing, so the junior staff is not inspired. There's no role model. Well, people wash their hands when they don't want to let the team down, but the team is not washing their hands, and people are not praised. So there is a social influence. And we understood the unique barriers in this context, the unique mechanism driving behavioral change and hand washing. And we went back to the design stage of new intervention using the behavioral change wheel, and we designed a brand new intervention. We use a nudge-a-thon approach, a co-creation with different teams, different stakeholders, using the framework and the techniques that I showed you in the previous slide to design a new intervention for Birmingham. They co-design in teams, they present at the end of the day, we give them a prize for the best solution, and we have a solution after this co-design stage, which is very simple. For example, the gel dispenser, it has a counter, and that counts down when used to give indication of normally daily use. We need certain numbers of hand washing episodes to happen in this ward, very unique for the ward. So it hasn't gone down, it means the norm is not fulfilled. We need to follow the norm. And also during handovers between staff, from one doctor to another doctor, we make speaking up the normal. How do we make speaking up the normal? There is a badge doctor wears, I'll be okay to be reminded to wash my hands. I won't get angry. There was also a sign that the doctor passing on the word to another doctor makes to remind the doctor he has to wash his hands during the shift, and so on and so forth. It was beautiful, and now we're going to test it. So, what is my message to you? So let's bring this full circle. We have talked about pluralism, mechanisms, and real-world messiness. And you might be wondering, can this approach also work in more personalized interventions? Absolutely. The very simple frameworks and design cycle we've discussed so far can be applied to what I like to call precision nudging. Just diagnose the mechanisms at individual level. It's the same behavioral toolkit, just the microscope turned up. And here's where Giuseppe AI magic comes in, artificial intelligence, by layering machine learning and data analytics on top of these behavioral diagnostics, so we can tailor interventions with a level of precision that used to belong only to medicine. So instead of one-size-fits-all nudges, we can design nudges that fit you like a glove, personalized, adaptive, and grounded in real behavioral mechanisms. That's the vision. Behavioral science, that's not only pluralistic and mechanistic, but precise, scalable, and truly human. And here's my colleague, Giuseppe, coming into the stage.
Thank you, Ivo. I think where all this fits in is the fact that for a long time there's been a mismatch between the degree of sophistication that behavioral sciences be able to produce in terms of theoretical approaches with the methods that people were using. I mean, after all, the foundation of doing behavioral science, as many other social science, is to at one point test either our interventions or our hypotheses to then produce reliable knowledge and accumulate this knowledge. But we're using randomized control trial. I mean, randomized control trial in the classic sense, they were developed in the 30s of the past centuries by Fisher in the context of agricultural testing, where he discovered that random allocation would basically take care of allocation bias and allow to do proper causal inference. His book, The Design of Experiments, is 1935. And the first social science application of RCTs were in the 60s in the US in the context of famous studies about education. So that kind of approach, the RCTs, the classic RCTs, gave us the kind of the language and the basic logic of causation to do proper causal inference. But now we live in a very exciting age of new approaches and new tools to do a better job on in that respect. So the kind of newest wave of causal methods give us scalable computational tools that can work with high-dimensional data. They can also discover rather than just assume structure of causal relationships, and they can personalize, as mentioned by Ivo, causal estimates. This is especially relevant for our behavioral RCTs, where heterogeneity and complex treatments mechanism are the norm rather than the exception. So the starting point is that as we expect to see heterogeneity in treatment effects, we can use this information to then gather the necessary, let's say, granularity to design interventions that work at the level of particular groups of people, or at the level of even back at the level of individuals. This is due to the fact that now we are able to collect data on a massive scale. Think about the fact that normally a survey is, I don't know, 30 data points per person. Now we can collect through digital means and a combination of different means thousands, even hundreds of thousands of data points per person and longitudinally. So that changes completely the way how we look at the mapping and the testing of our interventions, or also our theories. I like to think that a lot of theories we have in the social sciences that have been developed and tested on a rather small amount of data, simply because there was no alternative. So if we go to the next slide, please. When we talk about personalization, I think now we have the possibility of moving from different level of personalization of interventions. Here, the example is through the personalization of a hypothetical message. We can, send the same message to everyone and do the classic RCTs. We can start personalized, minimal type of personalization, as people have done in behavioral science. See what difference it makes to introduce, the name of the person or some kind of salutation, the custom to the person, and see how that affects the effectiveness of the message. Then we can tailor furthermore about personal content, so go down this level 2. Then we can tailor the timing where we deliver the message and the kind of preferences attached to it, up to the point where the messages can be different. And these are basically tailored on the fact that we found out at the previous stage that different mechanism affects different people. So we have a situation where we can personalize at different levels depending on the availability of data and our resources and the time we have. But I think personalization should be really intended in two ways. The first one is to increase effectiveness of our interventions, but the second one is also equally important, especially in the context of health, which is to avoid backfiring effect or harmful effect. What I mean here is that when we just test something and we go for an average treatment effect, we hide the fact that some people might be better off through our treatments, but some people might be worse off, and we just don't see that. And you want to avoid that. In my experience, I've been, for example, in the case of COVID vaccine hesitancy, try to nudge people to take the vaccine. You don't want to be in a situation where you test something and because of your intervention, some people will be less inclined to take the vaccine. To the very least, you want to have perhaps no effect, but then you want to improve the situation. So personalization allows us to harness the heterogeneity of your treatment effects in a way that you try to exclude the harmful effect. This is done in a number of ways. I mean, we don't have, to go into the details here, but if we go to the next slide, the idea here is that we can essentially play with the causal machine learning methods like causal forest, where basically what we can do is to look at discover the source of heterogeneity of our treatment effects and find out what is the most important sources of this heterogeneity. And then based on the fact that people will vary on these different sources of heterogeneity, could be characteristics of individuals of any kind, then we can counterfactually think about, okay, what would happen if we assign to these people the best effective nudge that work for people with those characteristics. And we can play this in a number of ways. And we have now very sophisticated methods that combines this causal machine learning with what is called optimal policy allocation of interventions, so that you increase the effectiveness, you reduce the risk of harm, and essentially you can also factor in cost. So these are methods that now are part of the toolbox of behavioral science. This is something actually we teach at BISI, and we will show you some of the training possibility that we offer on that. These are absolutely new stuff. That includes also the fact that now, as mentioned before by Ivo, there is a pluralism in methods in terms also going beyond studying interventions at the individual effect, because a randomized control trial often violates context in behavioral science violates one of the important assumptions of a randomized control trial, which is the no interference assumptions, meaning that individuals are not affected by other things like peers. But we do know that for a number of behaviors, from eating habits to smoking to a number of other things, peer effects are very strong. So there's network science methods now that can help us to integrate what we do in behavioral science with also network science. We can use agent-based models and all kind of now complex systems and methodologies. And if we go to the next slide, I would just show that basically what you can do is you move from average treatment effects to local average treatment effects, meaning group level treatment effects, up to ITE, so individual treatment effects. Now we are able to estimate treatment effects at the individual level, which give us essentially the path for personalization that can learn through time. And this is where essentially the new applications of AI are coming into place, as a lot of AI or agentic AI is meant to coach us, to give us help over time. The basic principle, or one of the basic principles, is reinforced learning. And in the next slide, basically, this is really what the AI-driven personalization is going to. We got a lot of more information signals, and reinforced learning is something that learns through attempts in nudging us. Imagine a AI coach. It will nudge us through time and learn what works and what doesn't, and then basically learn the heterogeneity of our responses, and then personalize through time and optimize the effect through testing different interventions. So we are now moving very much into a situation where we wanted to test efficacy of these interventions, but now we want to customize it, tailor, and understand the mechanism that works for different type of people, so that then we have a better understanding of the complexity behind the behavioral change aspects and potential not effective or even a negative effect we might find. And I'll stop here because I think we want to have a bit of time for questions from you. So I'll give the mic to Eugene. Back to Eugene.
I think before we go on to the Q&A, maybe Ivo and Giuseppe, do you want to talk about the classes that the programs that we have installed for our audience? Yep.
Yeah, so before we go to Q&A, let me leave you with one final thought. So if you enjoyed today's talk, you're now thinking maybe, okay, this pluralism thing actually makes sense, but how do I really apply it? Then you'll love what's coming next. Because what we covered today is the trailer, the highlight level. If you want the full feature film with every framework, method, and real-world application in glorious high definition, then join us for the Behavioral Science Bundle. It's a 3-part deep dive where we move from theory to practice. No fluff, no TED Talk vagueness, just real behavioral design. In February, we start with behavioral decision science, decoding how people actually think and choose. In April, we get hands-on with the nudge theory in action, where small changes drive big results in health, business, and policy. In health and business and policy, not just health. And in May, we turn it all up notch with precision nudging for health behavior interventions powered by Giuseppe's artificial intelligence wizardry. So if you want to learn not just what the behavioral frameworks are and how to use them properly, the behavioral change wheel, the mind space, and other frameworks, and more importantly, how to weave them together into that pluralistic, mechanistic methodology we discussed, this is your chance. Because to be honest, the world doesn't need more PowerPoints about behavioral change. It needs people who can actually do it. You, the change makers. And that's exactly what this bundle is designed for, turning good researchers and policymakers and managers into genuine behavioral change architects. So don't just leave inspired, leave with a plan. Join us and let's build the next generation of interventions, smarter interventions, sharper interventions, pluralistic interventions, and maybe even a little bit of rebellious interventions. Here's how to sign up on the screen. And you see the screen again. So, and with that, I'll stop nudging you for the next 5 minutes. Thank you all for your attention and great energy today. So let me now hand over to Dr. Eugene, who leads us into the Q&A session. We have to nudging yourself.
Thank you, Giuseppe and Ivo. So that was a very concise and great explanation, first of all, in terms of how nudge or nudging first came about and also became popular in governments in the world. And then following that, we had Giuseppe explaining as well about the importance of understanding not just average treatment effects, but also going down into more precision methods and the benefits of doing so as well. So maybe let me look at some of the questions that we have from the audience. And so I would like to remind everyone that is watching us live as well that you can drop in questions and then we'll try to answer them live as well. Keep them coming. So maybe for the first question that I have here, let me see. I think it's addressed to Ivo for the typical researcher, because you've covered a lot of frameworks out there. I think it can be quite daunting for the average person that is trying to implement behavioral science in practice. So what would be some key tips that you would like them to understand or know about in terms of which frameworks or methods to use, which are the popular ones that they can start to think about when it comes to applying behavioral science in practice?
Well, we'll start with which are the popular frameworks. That's a great question and one I get a lot. So on the slides, I've listed the 4 most popular framework, and I've used 2 of them myself in projects, the Mindspace and the Behavioral Change Wheel. The key thing to remember is that these frameworks are essentially catalogs of mechanisms of action, ways to unpack why and how behavior changes. So they're not perfect. None of them are totally comprehensive, but using them with the methodology outlined today, we already put you miles ahead of relying on intuition and tradition. So we can even plug in something like the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, CFIR, if you're working in implementation science. The evidence is very consistent. Using a theory, any theory, is better than using no theory at all. Otherwise, you're left with what many interventions still rely on, which is ideology, habit, and good intentions. So my advice is pick a framework, any framework, understand the mechanisms behind it, and then combine it intelligently with a pluralistic approach. That is where theory becomes genuinely useful in practice. So the second, how to decide which framework to use. The second question was how to decide which framework to use, right, if I remember correctly. It's an excellent question. Honestly, the answer is it depends what you're trying to change and where you're in the process of change, right? So if you're at the early diagnostic stage, frameworks such as Mindspace and the Behavioral Wheel, which also contains the COM-B model, capability, opportunity, motivation, and theoretical domains framework, the one I presented in the big tree diagram. These are very useful for mapping out what is driving the behavior. If you're focusing on implementation and context, then the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research or the Behavioral Wheel as well might give you better traction. So the trick is not to be a framework purist. Don't marry one model. Date around a little. Each framework shines in a different context, and by combining them, you can cover more mechanisms and avoid blind spots that come with single theory thinking. So I would say start with the problem, not the framework, then select or blend frameworks that help you unpack that particular behavioral mechanism in context.
Well, yeah, thank you. I think that's a very rich reply to a very relatively simple question. So I think that the key idea is to really start somewhere and start with a theoretical kind of framework rather than going in with guesswork. So I think that's a key takeaway from your message, Ivo. Maybe for the next point, this is for Prof. Giuseppe. What would be some methods that a person has to know in order to work with your methods? So I think in terms of maybe skills, understanding of certain maybe software or approaches, what would be some of them that are necessary kind of prerequisites in order to fully engage with some of the methods that you were mentioning about earlier?
Well, I think we try to train people from scratch. I mean, from the beginning, obviously. But I would say that any basic understanding of, let's say, statistical methods, I mean, basic statistics that you usually taught to do research is necessary. I think the new methods is really about understanding the logic behind them and how they work and they operate. Then, of course, there are different level of proficiency that you might want to achieve. That means it means you might simply use what is available or just customize it to your needs. And that requires a bit of sort of programming skills. But these programming skills, again, these days it's a lot easier to learn them, and is usually learned in a kind of learn by doing context, meaning that you will develop something through a process of applying concrete examples. And we try a lot to do that in our teaching, so that it's not just abstract, or purely statistical, or it is always linked, let's say, to problem solving, and I think that makes it much more approachable. But it's really a way of thinking. I think the sort of understanding of these causal inference methods is fundamentally a way of thinking.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a good opportunity as well to highlight that anyone that is probably signing up or interested in signing up in the programs in any of the three classes would be able to learn some of these techniques and should not be afraid of learning some of these techniques, because it's designed for people to pick up the skills as part of the course. Am I right, Giuseppe?
Yes, absolutely. We put a lot of effort in designing courses that they allow the gradual build-up of understanding and knowledge of these methods, where, of course, we know that it's a starting point where then people can continuously learn themselves through further practice.
That's great. Maybe for the both of you now, but we'll start with Ivo first. We have this question of what are the main challenges in applying a pluralistic approach in the real world? So I think you've mentioned some of them, both of you, but maybe for the average intervention that someone is trying to make a difference in the workplace, make a difference in clinical practice, what would be some of these key challenges in terms of applying a pluralistic approach, and in terms of understanding them, what are some tips or advice as experts yourself that you can impart to this aspiring change makers, for example?
To the change makers, the main challenge, my main challenge, is that pluralism sounds elegant in theory and chaotic in practice. You're combining disciplines, methods, worldviews, so you inevitably hit a few translation issues. Economists want parsimony, psychologists want nuance, implementers want something they can do by Monday, as soon as possible. Pressing need. The way to manage that is to build shared language, usually around mechanisms. That's why my framework was presented at the beginning. Outcome is driven by behavior. Behavior is driven by mechanisms. Mechanisms are influenced by techniques. There's a causal chain. And once everybody agrees that we are targeting this mechanism in this context, collaboration becomes much easier. Much easier. Another challenge is that organizations often want certainty and simplicity, especially healthcare organizations, while pluralism is inherently complex. So the art is to simply simplify the delivery of pluralism, not the thinking behind it. Leave the thinking to the frameworks. They're complex enough. You saw the numerous white squares on the screen of the Mindspace framework, and also the behavioral change wheel framework. It's complex, but not too complex, so everybody can understand, because that's the purpose of these frameworks, to simplify the whole knowledge of several disciplines over 100 years into something tangible in a taxonomy everybody can pick and apply to diagnose the big why and to give them the big how to change.
Okay, Giuseppe?
I think to complement what just Ivo said is that pluralism usually, to me, poses also the challenge that different theoretical approaches, different disciplines often require testing or analyzing things at different level of analysis. So you are combining things at the individual level, psychology, cognitive science, with things that they are at the system level, sociology, in part economics, and this multi-level type of analysis poses a lot of challenges. And I think that is why we need a pluralistic methodology, and to avoid that. Often disciplines bring their own repertoire of things, and they're very conservative about using always the same stuff. So then you end up in this situation where everything you see is a nail because the only thing you have is a hammer, and that's what we want to avoid. So in addition to what Ivo said, I think the thinking again in a broader way, also in terms of your methodology, your way of thinking of testing, it can be a challenge, but also can be extremely rewarding and revealing when you manage to do it.
Yeah, so I think that leads on to this other question that is quite common I can see in the Q&A here. So maybe I'll just repackage it for the both of you to answer. So it's this concern with, and I think early on when we started to do behavior change techniques and behavior change interventions at the government level, there was always this opposing voice that how do you know what's best for the population? Because to do some of these interventions would necessarily assume that we might know what's better. And so, like, how do we justify that? And I think a related question to this later on was, how do you manage the potential for backfiring? Because if people know that they are being nudged, and we know people don't like to know that they are being manipulated, how do we go about navigating some of these concerns that people might have? So maybe I'll reverse now, and I'll start with Giuseppe first.
So, well, okay, this is clearly part of the core debate has been in behavioral science about, let's say, the so-called political economy of behavioral science. But there are different positions on that. But my personal view is that, first of all, there are now evolution of the nudge methods that include much more transparency and delegation of agency to individuals, like the so-called nudge plus approach or boosting. And what we've seen is that actually when people know they're being nudged, it doesn't decrease their effectiveness. So to let them know that they're being nudged is possible. The second is that, of course, to decide what is the common good or what is the, let's say, the thing that should be nudged for, it doesn't exclude the fact that you need to have some kind of deliberation on that. So nudge doesn't exclude the fact that you need to have legitimacy about the decision of the direction in which you go. Given that, however, I come from a background where nudging was also done in a protective way, because it's not only government that do nudge. There is a lot of other actors that do nudge behavioral interventions. And I worked for many years for the European Commission to protect consumers from nudging in the bad sense, like dark patterns online or all this sort of stuff. So in that respect, nudge is really it's a tool in a way, and then what you need to understand is the context of deliberation. So we don't have the time to go into the different tradition, let's say, but I think the work of Peter John here really explains how there can be democratic legitimacy in these type of interventions in the context of contemporary societies. Yeah.
Ivo, do you have anything to add to that? Yeah.
Very hard to add, Giuseppe. For me to add, thank you. But just remind you, public acceptability is number one if we intervene on people. And the good old ethical argument that we won more than 10 years ago, leaving the freedom to people to decide to act otherwise. not to change if they want to. Don't force them to change. And also the second important argument that not nudging, not influencing people is also choice by policymakers, leaving them where they are, in the gutter sometimes. And the third ethical argument, the impact on others. Harmful behavior, like smoking, for example, to take one out of many, you're harming others. So you don't have the right to protest here when we nudge you. And finally, I share opinion with Paul Dolan. We work together a lot on creating the Mindspace framework and also to investigate human well-being and human happiness. And for me, the ultimate test of the importance of nudging and the right to nudge is to measure well-being. So if you improve subjective well-being, simple terms, human happiness, as a result of your intervention, that's a good indicator that intervention is pushing people in the right direction. And also indicator what you can continue nudging and what works and what doesn't work. So you change behavior to improve subjective well-being, which informs your intervention, how to improve your intervention in behavioral change. So measure subjective well-being at individual and also national level. Many governments are doing that as a better indicator of national progress than GDP, gross domestic products.
Yeah, thank you. I think those are very good points. And I think Ivo's, your reply actually touches on one of the other questions that one of our participants have. So I think because we are left with just a couple of minutes, maybe we would like to leave everyone with some key takeaways. What would be your one tip or key takeaway for anyone that is aspiring or interested in applying behavioral science in practice? Maybe Ivo, do you want to go first? Just one key takeaway.
Precision level approaches are like using a megaphone. You design policies, campaigns, or environments that shift behavior across many people at once. Think taxation on sugar, default pension enrollment, smoke-free zones. These interventions are broad, scalable, and very powerful sometimes, but they treat the population as a kind of average person. Individual level approaches, on the other hand, are more like using a microphone. You're listening close to the one person's mechanism. You design what drives their behavior, maybe a motivational issue, maybe a knowledge gap or a habit loop, and then tailor the intervention accordingly. And the frameworks I've given you, just the framework to understand the causal pathway, to understand the mechanisms, and to design the intervention, the circle, gives you the toolkit to achieve this success. And then the population level changes the context people live in, and the individual level helps people navigate that context successfully. So both approaches are vital. That's the message. Both are vital. And what's exciting now is that with the data and AI, we can start linking the two, designing population frameworks that still adapt to individual mechanisms. In other words, moving from one size fits most to one size adapts.
Thank you. I think that's a very great point. I think that would be somewhat similar to what Giuseppe might provide as well. What would be, your one tip? Sorry, yeah, muted. Giuseppe.
Sorry, yeah. I was saying, since Ivo said more or less what I would say, I can only add that now it's a really exciting moment to do social science research, because I think there's a lot of innovation happening. And I think, if you have an interest in that area, you already have skills or knowledge, I think that's a great time to join us and do, some work on this, learn new things, because I think we are moving in an area where we now have the means, tools to do real change. And I think also we probably are for the first time, I think, in the history of social science, we have the capacity to learn about the complexity of society to a level that it simply didn't happen before. And it will change. I think it will change a lot how we think about a lot of social problems, about interventions, about how to make policy. So I think I would think that if you are interested in these areas, now is really the time to get more training. Yeah.
And to reach out to us if you have any other questions, because we couldn't cover all the questions. So if you're interested in working with us or knowing more about our work, do reach out to us. Our contact details are on the website. But without further ado, maybe we'll just flash the slides for the Yes.
Well,
And
yeah.
that's the end of the 15th webinar that we have. Thank you, Giuseppe and Ivo. Thank you, everyone who's present. If you're interested, do register and sign up for our programs over here.
Absolutely. If today's session felt like a good teaser trailer, and you actually want the full movie and the frameworks, the mechanism, the real application step by step, then don't just log off inspired. Log off enrolled. Join us for the behavioral science bundle. We will take everything we touched today, the mind space, the behavioral wheel, the combis, the pluralism, the precision nudging, and go under the hood. So if you want to go from knowing about behavioral change to actually designing it, come and join us. We will even throw in a little AI magic from Giuseppe to keep BISI. Same frameworks, same methodology, but this time you leave a behavioral change expert. Here's how you sign up.
Thank you, everyone. And we hope to see you again soon.